We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Hey guys! For those who are asking, here is part 45 of What If Naruto was assigned to Asuma and Team 10. Mizuki never got to shoot his mouth off at Naruto the night he took the Scroll of Seals. Other than skipping a half-manic monologue from him, what exactly did this change for everyone's favorite blonde ninja? Who knows? Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 80, To the Bitter End. A plan coming together had never been so dangerous. The entire point of getting Orochimaru to fully transform was so he could find the location of his seal. He'd seen it, just for an instant. Much like Naruto, Orochimaru had placed it directly across his belly. Normally, that would have made for a great target. But Orochimaru's belly was now covered by a hard shell. Finding a way to screw with the seal, the bulk of his plan, had become that much more complicated. Jiraiya struggled to maintain his distance from Orochimaru. His old friend had taken things to the next level in transforming into the Sandbai in order to fully crush him. He could hear Orochimaru crashing through the forest behind him, feel the ground shake as trees fell and the mammoth body of the transformed jinchuriki. Son of a bitch, Jiraiya thought to himself as he continued to try and stay ahead of the destruction behind him. How is he so fast when he's so big? Turning to try and stop Orochimaru physically wasn't an option. That left him with limited options. As he worked through a few hand signs to make his next move, Orochimaru rumbled through the area he'd been in. Curled into a ball, Orochimaru utilized the spiked shell of the Sandbai to flatten the forest, clearing a massive straight line in the path of his choosing. Just before he overtook Jiraiya, a massive puff of smoke signaled the arrival of the Toad Sannin's summoned savior. The body of the Sandbai found itself stopped cold by the webbed hands of empty Miyaboku's boss Toad. Jiraiya stood atop Gamabunta's head, wiping away a bead of worried sweat as his old friend struggled against Orochimaru's tailed beast form. Sorry about the timing on that one, Bunta. You idiot. Gamabunta scolded, audibly straining to hold Sandbai Orochimaru back. Your plan was to summon me the moment he transformed. What happened to that? Jiraiya didn't have much of an excuse. The game plan for how he would tackle Orochimaru one-on-one had been laid out days ago. What can I say? I guess I got caught up in the moment. Caught up in the moment, he says, Gamabunta parroted tauntingly. Fei. With a great bellow of force, Gamabunta reared back and tossed Sandbai Orochimaru clear over his head. Sandbai Orochimaru's shell hit the ground with an earth-shaking crash, bouncing him just high enough in the air for him to unball his body and land on his feet. If Orochimaru was surprised by the new arrival, he didn't show it. Ah, Gamabunta, Orochimaru said, as though he were greeting an old friend, and not an adversary in a fight to the death. It's been so long. You look well. As well as one can look when they're getting on in years. Gamabunta let out a snort at the attempt at an insult. Toad elders lived for centuries. We can't all hijack the bodies of little boys and girls to keep ourselves young and spry. Some of us are willing to make do with the natural process of aging, and some of us endeavor to become the masters of nature, Orochimaru said, while chuckling. His usual disturbing laughter made that much more potent in the body of the Sandbai. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. The body of the Sandbai itself began to retract and expand, pulling all of its limbs into its shell. The unnatural-looking occurrence grew even odder, when from the top of the shell where the head was, Orochimaru seemed to shed the shell. The massive, spiky, gray body of a snake wriggled its way out of the carcass of what Jiraiya and Gamabunta thought had been the Sandbai. Orochimaru rose to his full height in this form, unfurling a jagged hood around his head, revealing three tails moving him along on the ground. The pipe in Gamabunta's mouth nearly fell. Just when they thought there was nothing else Orochimaru was capable of that could surprise them. How? It was the only thing Gamabunta could find himself able to say. Orochimaru took great pleasure in the grizzled toad's reaction to his form. This body is still a vessel. One that I can experiment on and modify to my liking. As powerful as the Sandbai is, it doesn't really mesh with my aesthetic, does it? He asked, rhetorically. Kukukukuku. Well, at least it didn't. This was not the Sandbai. Orochimaru's tailed beast form was a perversion of what the creature had been. He couldn't even be bothered to respect the creature he had managed to enslave. He simply stripped its power and threw it around as he saw fit. Jiraiya slowly shook his head in disbelief. Orochimaru, how could you do this? Just what the hell is it that you want? He bellowed angrily. What I want has never changed, Jiraiya. Orochimaru crowed victoriously. If anything, my aims have merely evolved. Jiraiya could agree with that. Orochimaru's aims had evolved, as well as the means he was willing to take to obtain them, into ever more sinister and depraved extensions of the original selfish desire. Orochimaru continued to bemoan his plight. The current system of shinobi is so limiting for men of vision like myself. In order to gain the freedom to do as I wish, it must be done away with. As long as it exists, there will always be lapdogs like you, willing to pursue me because men of influence have a problem with my methods. People like him. People with standards and morals. People that were sick of seeing their friends, their villages victimized by this serpent who kept slipping between the cracks. It's because you're a monster. Jiraiya shouted back heatedly, you let yourself become a monster. And for what? Because dying scares you. Hiruzen used to tell Jiraiya to look at Orochimaru to see what a shinobi is supposed to be. The old man had been half right. Orochimaru embodied the darker, more selfish aspects of what those in their profession could slip to. It was infuriating, and it wouldn't have been so much so if Orochimaru would have just acknowledged how horrible he was. He knew it. He delighted in it, in fact. He had always enjoyed being that person, holding that reputation out of the three of them between himself, Jiraiya, and Tsunade. This needed to happen. It needed to end. Jiraiya could no longer stand the sight of what had become of his former comrade. Doing away with Sanbai Orochimaru was long overdue, no matter what it took from him. Jiraiya wasn't certain how long Gamabunta could stay summoned, and he expected the battle to be intense enough to shorten that time frame. The sooner they got things over with, the better. Gamabunta flicked the hilt of his tanto, brandishing the silver of the blade into the frigid open air. As the sound of sliding steel rang out, Sanbai Orochimaru moved in an instant. Gamabunta and Jiraiya watched him move, but both were left stunned when he wound up behind them regardless. Gamabunta spun around, swinging his tanto once he realized his position had been compromised, but by the time he turned, Sanbai Orochimaru's massive body was gone again. As a measure of self-preservation, Gamabunta leapt high into the air to get a bird's-eye view of the battlefield, lest he find himself caught from behind for the third time in one day. How is he faster than Manda? Gamabunta cried out. Once he eyed Sanbai Orochimaru's form slithering across the snowy, forested landscape, he took close aim and formed a tiger seal, Suetun, Tepidama, water release, gunshot. A massive ball of water shot out of his mouth with a moist shockwave around his lips. It wasn't a direct hit, but it hit the ground close enough that it partially exploded on Sanbai Orochimaru. Gamabunta landed and peered over in the direction his attack had landed. Once the boss toad had definitively returned to the ground, he was back within reach of the predatory jinchuriki after him. Sanbai Orochimaru burst from the ground, mouth wide open. But it was a play straight out of his old enemy Manda's book. Gamabunta turned his tanto upside down and jammed it right down the throat of the emerging serpent. However, Jiraiya, still in sage mode, could feel the presence of Orochimaru still slithering about. Bunta, that's not dash. Herk. Gamabunta let out a sharp grunt as a pair of fangs sank into his side. Looking down and over at the place of the injury, he saw Sanbai Orochimaru, jaw unhinged. Why, Gamabunta, Orochimaru taunted with his mouth full, I do believe you've killed one of my tails. True enough, at the end of Orochimaru's body, there was one tail shorter than the other two, steadily growing to match the rest in size. Cutting off one of the tails not only meant that Sanbai Orochimaru could simply grow it back, it made it possible for the severed tail to become a mindless copy. Even if Orochimaru had only been a jinchuriki for a month, it was likely he'd been studying them for years. Jiraiya had as well, for training Naruto, but he'd stuck to more conventional knowledge to help his student along. Innovation was for when one had a full scope of what was already possible. Or, for madmen like Orochimaru, it was entirely possible that he'd skipped steps. Whatever steps existed for something so undefined, anyway. It was widely accepted that the Sanbai was the most docile of the nine-tailed beasts. With the special qualities of Orochimaru's host to control the creature, that gave the man a blank slate to do with the power what he wished. Jiraiya winced at the suffering of his friend. There was no doubt Orochimaru had injected Gamabunta with some heinous sort of venom when he bit him. Gamabunta needed to be tended to, and quickly. There was no need to subject the boss toad to any more danger. Bunta, go home. With a hand seal, Jiraiya released Gamabunta from his summoning before he could be challenged about it. Jiraiya knew he would hear about it later, if he survived, but it was for Gamabunta's own good. Under the veil of smoke created by Gamabunta's departure, Jiraiya dropped down onto Orochimaru's head, forming a massive Rasengan, larger than his entire body, Senpu, Cho Otama Rasengan, Sage Art, Ultra Great Ball Spiraling Sphere. It had almost worked once when Orochimaru had been in human form. This time, he was a far bigger target, with much more to aim at, and Jiraiya had the advantage of falling down on him when he couldn't see it coming. At least, he thought he did. As Jiraiya fell, he wound up hitting nothing. No part of Sanbai Orochimaru was underneath him, and he landed cleanly on the ground, ridding himself of the chakra-draining Rasengan in his possession. How could something so large move so fast? Screw this, Jiraiya thought to himself, pressing his palms together. Kekai, Tengai Hojin, barrier, canopy method formation, with a barrier enacted that would tell him when anything got close, and the reaction time provided by Sage Mode. He would be damned if he'd let Orochimaru get off a surprise attack on him. Only, nothing happened. No attack from Orochimaru ever came. Jiraiya extended the keen senses of Sage Mode to locate Orochimaru, getting a bead on his sizable chakra signature over 2 kilometers away. Jiraiya looked in the offending direction curiously. Why would he retreat? He's winning. Jiraiya was poisoned. His support was gone. It didn't make any sense. The answer came quickly when he felt a significant upward spike of Orochimaru's concentrated chakra. Oh, you've got to be fucking kidding me. A tailed beast ball was being charged, and he was the target. On cliff face overlooking the snowy, forested valley where he'd been fighting Jiraiya, Orochimaru cackled at his first practical application of a tailed beast ball in combat. One of the first thing Orochimaru mastered upon taking control of the Sanbai was learning to create a tailed beast ball. Seeing as how he had full access to the Sanbai's chakra right out of the gate, all he had to do was learn to balance the chakra ratio needed to create a stable attack. Such a thing was child's play for him. It didn't take very long at all to find the right combination he needed. Still though, he had never utilized the technique in battle, until now. Sanbai Orochimaru's mouth was wide open, with a dark, glowing dark ball of chakra pulsing in the space of his open maw. Swallowing the tailed beast ball whole, his cheeks expanded before he spat the finished object forth. It shot forth like a cannonball, tearing through the forest until it reached its destination, where it then detonated. Where there had once been a lush pine forest, there was now a massive smoking crater. Orochimaru couldn't have been happier about it. Coo. Outstanding. The man who was more serpent than human crowed in delight. While the tailed beast ball wasn't quite as aesthetic as he would have liked his jutsu to be, the destruction it caused more than made up for how unsightly it was. Effective was effective. Had a tailed beast ball been necessary? Probably not. Orochimaru had a tendency to play with his food. It was a bad habit, yes. One that had not been worked out of him in almost 5 decades of experience as a shinobi. In this case, though, Orochimaru didn't see it as a bad thing. His playing around wasn't done to draw the battle with Jiraiya out. If anything, what he'd done could be constituted as overkill. Thank you for coming, Jiraiya, Sanbai Orochimaru said in parting, though the subject of the remark was unable to hear him. I'm so glad I got to share this with you. No matter how far he got away from those days in Konoha, there would always be a piece of him that would remember the good times there. Jiraiya was involved in many of those good times. But those were in the past, behind him. What seemed to lie ahead was bright from Orochimaru's point of view. Or at least it was gray, because he was all of a sudden looking up at the cloudy sky. And then he saw the ground, just before he was slammed to it, hard. And then, again, and one last time as well. Feeling that he had been grabbed by one of his tails, Sanbai Orochimaru writhed the other two to try and swat at his assailant, eventually shedding his skin to escape. Rearing around with a hiss to take note of his new enemy, he only got the sight of his old skin being thrown in his face for the trouble. The punch to the head that followed knocked him clear off of the cliffside he'd been observing his tailed beast ball from. He'd never gotten a look at just who had done the deed, but there was only one person he knew of capable of doing such a thing, while also being small enough to escape his sight. Tsunade landed on the ground and stared coldly out at the frosty expanse she'd sent Orochimaru plunging out into. The wind howled around her as she exhaled sharply, her breath visible in the air. With that handled, at least temporarily, she turned her concern to Jiraiya. She hadn't been able to reach Orochimaru before he fired a tailed beast ball, but she had definitely seen the effects of it. She doubted anyone within at least a day's traveling distance of ground zero could have missed it. Jiraiya was tough and versatile, but there wasn't anything she could think of that could stand up to the force of a detonating tailed beast ball. Even so, It was harder to believe that it had finished him off. Not if she didn't see the body first. Come on, you old goat. Tsunade muttered to herself, fists clenched, I swear to God, if you're dead. Tsunade Heim. A voice croaked faintly nearby. Tsunade turned to find Jiraiya standing there, looking a complete mess. His face was concealed by the still intact mask from the Uzumaki clan temple, but his clothes were torn and singed. He was covered in burns and blood. Most notably, his left hand was gone entirely, dripping blood from a hastily wrapped bandage. Only Sage Mode and Jiraiya's own innate toughness had kept him standing and moving forward by that point. Tsunade was horrified at the sight of him and immediately launched into fixing the most severe of wounds that she could see. Jiraiya nearly collapsed against her, using her body to keep himself upright as healing hands put him back together. It wasn't the first time Tsunade had the life of a white-haired man who was important to her in her hands. This time, however, she was able to deal with the severest traumas dealt to Jiraiya, keeping him alive enough to speak to him familiarly. Tsunade proceeded to chide him, you were coming up here to keep fighting him, weren't you? Jiraiya didn't answer at first. Not with words, anyway, merely grunting in return, dumbass. How did you even survive that? A bit of brashness had returned to Jiraiya's demeanor, I was training Naruto to use his tailed beast chakra. You think this is the first time I've had a tailed beast bomb fired at me? His bravado faded when he looked down at his newly missing left hand. Never had to avoid one that big before though. He had clearly paid the price for it. Had Tsunade not been there, Jiraiya was heading for what likely would have been his certain death. Tsunade finished up quickly enough, giving his worst wounds a once-over, where he then stopped her. Even if she had given Orochimaru a clean knock, he would be resurfacing any moment. How did you get here? Jiraiya asked while there was a temporary lull. Tsunade suddenly gave Jiraiya a sideways glance, you had your team tracking him. You weren't worried about anyone tracking you. His team. Tenzo. Anko. With the ferocity of his fight with Orochimaru, it had slipped his mind that his compatriots had been left with their own troubles. Tsunade huffed, that's why I'm late. I had to bail your little trump card out of trouble, then send Shizune after the other. She gestured down below where trees were growing out of the ground, restricting a struggling Orochimaru. This one wasted all of his chakra subduing the fake jinchuriki. There Tenzo was, alive and well, working to restrict Sanbai Orochimaru with his vaunted Mokuton. Jiraiya couldn't help but smile, huh? I'll be damned. Tenzo had been his first, best plan to help deal with Orochimaru. When he'd had to break off to stop the horde of pseudo-jinchuriki after them, that left Jiraiya having to rely on his backup plans, none of which had paid off. Now there was a pretty good chance once again that they could pull this off. It was enough to brighten the mood, despite the desperate moment. His smile quickly fell when he looked over at Tsunade again and saw the pure anger in the woman's eyes. Never had he been so thankful he'd been wearing the Uzumaki clan mask, so that Tsunade didn't see the reaction on his face. She may have healed him, but she was not happy with him. He could only imagine how mad she would have been if he wasn't so filthy she couldn't see the physical effects of Orochimaru's poisoning. They didn't have the time for her to deal with that, and there was no need to have that hanging in the air. You selfish son of a bitch. Tsunade seethed. Jiraiya could take a guess at why she was upset. Tsunade dash. No, fuck you. The medic cut him off, not allowing him the chance to try and make excuses for keeping her out of the loop. You think you have the right to keep that you're going after Orochimaru to yourself? Jiraiya hadn't told her. Hiruzen hadn't told her. She'd had an idea the entire time. It was common knowledge amongst higher-up shinobi about Orochimaru's recent actions. Jiraiya's sudden departure from the village was timely, considering the summit Hiruzen had been called to. It told her something was being done to try and help Konoha save some face on the world stage. If the Hokage was going to the table with the fire daimyo and the head samurai of Tetsu no Kuni, he needed something to hand them that showed they were cleaning up one of the biggest messes in their history. Orochimaru's head on a silver platter would serve nicely. It didn't hurt that she'd also found Orochimaru's last student had conveniently vanished on a clandestine mission at the exact same time. In the end, it had been a hunch, but one with enough elements to give her reason to consider following Jiraiya. She felt fortunate and enraged at the same time when her theory had been proven correct. Jiraiya, to his credit, seemed remorseful at leaving her out. You never seemed to want to be involved with Konoha business, Heim. Tsunade sneered at that excuse. He was right, and yet oh so wrong at the same time. It's not just Konoha business. It's my business too, she declared. I'm just as responsible for the evil shit Orochimaru got up to as you or Sensei. Jiraiya shook his head, a bark of empty laughter escaping him. You can't put that on yourself. You weren't there. Tsunade's fury froze over like water in the frigid environment they found themselves in. She smiled over at Jiraiya bitterly. That's right. I wasn't there. One less set of eyes on him. One less person that could stop him, when there were only 3 others at the time who could have done it in the first place. Hiruzen had lacked the stomach to do what had been needed, to kill the monster that his precious student had become. Jiraiya had lacked the resolve to so much as fight against Orochimaru when his treachery had become known. Tsunade would not have shared either of their weaknesses. She would have fought, and she would have done so with the intent to put him down for good. Tsunade let out a deep sigh, her brown eyes sorrowful as she spoke, and now, look at him. Look at us. The legendary Sannin, Konoha's greatest living legacy of screw-ups. I mean, now that Danzo's dead, yeah, probably, Jiraiya joked, trying to bring a bit of levity to the proceedings. So, we really doing this? Tsunade cracked her knuckles. If you even suggest that I leave, I'll deal with you before I deal with him. Jiraiya wasn't going to question the assistance again. Not only because of how intense Tsunade seemed, but because it wasn't like he had been winning up until Tsunade's intervention. He'd been keeping pace by the skin of his teeth. Orochimaru's strength was overwhelming. Even with Tenzo's Mokuton, he couldn't seem to restrain Orochimaru. One more thing, Tsunade said, before they went to rejoin the fight, don't think I didn't notice. Ha! Jiraiya said, confusedly. Tsunade raised an eyebrow at him and pointed to the leg of his tattered pants, where he had been bitten by Orochimaru's snake. The skin surrounding the wound had a green tint to it. Oh! Jiraiya droned, realizing that he hadn't been as sly as he would have liked. Whoops. Just hold out for a bit longer, idiot, Tsunade said, her gaze softening for a moment. I'll fix you just as soon as we get a moment. But first, they had a rabid dog to put down. If the 2 of them were there, they would fight Orochimaru together. Whatever it took. Tenzo found it ironic that the power forcefully instilled in him by Orochimaru as an experiment was being used to bring about the man's demise. He'd been waiting his entire life for the chance to get even, and he couldn't help but feel a thrilling rush pass through him at the idea. It would have been something worth smiling over, if he were actually winning. The Mokuton was a powerful Kekii Genkai. The Shodai Hokage had been known to be capable of suppressing tailed beasts. Thus, it was assumed that Tenzo could do the same, or at least perform well enough at the task that he could temporarily subdue one. Tenzo readily admitted that his Mokuton techniques paled in comparison to the Shodai. Now, as he struggled against a Sanbai Orochimaru who kept breaking the wooden stalks he kept forming to hold the massive serpent down, he knew for certain that his tailed beast suppression techniques did as well. And yet, it was all he could do to try and restrain the enemy before him. Sanbai Orochimaru was wrapped in tree roots, holding him to the ground as 10 massive spiked wood pillars encircled him. The palm of Tenzo's hand read with the kanji 4th sit, as chakra extended from him to Orochimaru. So, this is how you choose to die. Orochimaru hissed as he continued fighting his way out of his captured state. I would have figured a test subject of mine would have known better than to ever get anywhere near me again. Tenzo didn't rise at the attempt to set him off. His focus was solely on dealing with the Sanbai's tailed beast chakra. And yet, he was almost out of chakra to do so. Tsunade had used some of her chakra to restore enough of his to allow him to be a viable contributor, but it took a considerable amount to maintain what he was doing for as long as he was doing it. He was slipping, and Orochimaru would be out before he could stop him. Tsutenkyaku, heavenly foot of pain. Tsunade dropped from the cliff above, delivering a falling axe kick that obliterated everything unfortunate enough to be beneath it, from the binding trees to the solid ground. Orochimaru, unfortunately, was not one of those things. In fact, the Sanbai was no longer in sight. The human Orochimaru marched out of the smoke and debris Tsunade caused. Ku. Orochimaru chuckled to himself, brushing himself off. So many of you whose lives I've touched have come so far to see me. I'm touched. Who's next, I wonder? He sounded amused, but there was no mistaking the undertone of annoyance and anger in the man's voice. Orochimaru had wanted to flex his muscles and settle an old score. He had been dragged into this troublesome fight against Jiraiya, who just wouldn't roll over and die. The Toad Sage had survived long enough for backup to arrive. Backup that Orochimaru had accounted for in Tenzo, and backup that he'd never imagined would find their way to the battlefield in Tsunade. To his credit, Tenzo had no plans to back down from Orochimaru. The Sannin was the target. They weren't leaving without confirming his death. Even if he fled, they would continue to pursue him to the ends of the planet. That had been the understanding he'd had when he'd been slated to go. At that moment, Jiraiya appeared at Tenzo's side, putting a hand on the man's shoulder. "Thank you, Tenzo." Tenzo didn't like the way Jiraiya had said that. The tone, it was all wrong. It wasn't a thank you like, "Good job, but we still have more work to do." It was the kind of thank you like, "Thank you for all of your contributions. You owe me nothing else." To Tenzo's horror, Jiraiya confirmed this to him, "You're done here. Find Enko, find Shizen, and start heading back to Konoha. The mission dash. The mission will be seen through," Jiraiya said. "He's not leaving here alive, no matter what. I'll make damn sure of that." Tenzo would have been lying if he didn't admit that he was concerned with that. The desire to see Orochimaru pay for his crimes had been the primary drive for him wanting to take part in the mission. Still, what concerned him more was the way Jiraiya had assured him that this would happen. It sounded final. It was also an order from a superior. The ANBU in him wouldn't let him disobey. Thus, with great apprehension, Tenzo departed, off to search for Anko and Shizen. That left the Sannin alone, Orochimaru standing with Jiraiya at his front, and Tsunade at his back. "I'm surprised you changed back, Orochimaru," Jiraiya taunted. "It seemed like you enjoyed being larger than life. What happened?" Orochimaru figured that being so massive wouldn't matter against someone like Tsunade. In fact, being that much bigger was a liability if she'd already proven she could hit him, even as fast as he was. More size just meant a bigger target for her to cripple once her fists made contact. And when she hit him, there was no guarantee that he would be able to continue afterwards. Orochimaru scoffed, "Believe me, Jiraiya. I don't need to be in my tailed beast form to be larger than life," he boasted, before taking on a tone of mocking concern. "But enough about me. How are you doing?" Jiraiya glared from behind his mask and cut him off before he could say too much in front of Tsunade. "I've still got enough left to put you away." Tsunade wasn't in any mood to talk, and without preamble, formed a snake seal with her hands. Doton, Daichi Ganzho, earth release, ground bedrock. Two gigantic walls of rock rose up and surrounded Orochimaru in an attempt to crush him. Orochimaru slithered out of harm's way before anything could befall him. It was all a move to corral Orochimaru towards Jiraiya, who was prepared for his escape attempt. Katon, Enden, fire release, flame bullet. Jiraiya spat masses of oil from his mouth, igniting them on the way out to create flaming globs meant to catch Orochimaru in a barrage. Still, Orochimaru was too slippery. When it came to evasion, he was the best of the three of them at it, having come up with numerous modifications to his body to assist in his maneuverability. Tsunade was second best, however, by a close margin, and fearlessly charged into Jiraiya's flaming barrage from Orochimaru's blind spot to chase him down and bludgeon him. As she got danger close, Orochimaru's head turned nearly 180 degrees, the tip of the Kusanagi sword peeking from his mouth. Tsunade ducked under the blade as Orochimaru took it into his hand. The two engaged in a game of cat and mouse that more closely resembled a dance of death through a storm of flames flying between them. Tsunade deftly dodged each attempt by Orochimaru to stab or slash at her. She quickly turned her defense to offense on a dime, lashing out with swift punches and kicks, any one of which would leave Orochimaru splattered all over the wall of the nearby cliff. Orochimaru eventually found himself pinned, his back against the wall. He defied gravity, rolling up the wall until planting the soles of his feet against it. He pressed his hands to the vertical surface. Doton, Ganseki Kazushi, earth release, rock collapse. From the top of the cliff down, entire rock formations broke apart, with massive chunks coming down on their heads. It was as if the entire mountain was falling. "Tsunade!" Jiraiya shouted as he watched from nearby. He charged forward as his old teammate was seemingly buried alive. Katon, Chukuen Jushu Kiryu, fire release, hollow flame updraft. Jiraiya narrowly avoided a massive tower of fire that shot up from the ground. From a hidden location, Orochimaru bombarded him with underground attacks set to roast him alive. Torrents of flame erupted upward from cracks in the ground that burst into full tunnels. The only warning he had to new hotspots was a moment of superheating beneath his feet. Meanwhile, within the avalanche zone, Tsunade protected herself by propping up a large piece of rock against what was left of the cliff wall. Gritting her teeth, she waited for the worst to pass before attempting to punch her way out. In the midst of the rockslide, numerous small snakes coated in Orochimaru's chakra started working their way through the fallen rocks all around her. Tsunade's eyes went wide, and she hurried with her escape, barreling her way through the remains of the cliff with her fists. It was during this time that she discovered paper tags attached to a considerable amount of the rubble, likely placed there by Orochimaru's snakes before they made their way to her. Tsunade quickly drew her own blood and summoned hastily as the tags burned down, Kuchios no Jutsu, summoning jutsu. She covered herself in summoned slugs as a protective measure just before the explosive notes burned down and detonated. Boom! The field of rubble was pulverized by a chain of massive explosions. Orochimaru's best efforts to divide Jiraiya and Tsunade before conquering them simultaneously seemed to be working. From his hiding place, Orochimaru smirked to himself. His former teammates were good, some of the best, in fact. But of the three of them, he had always been superior. Not too long ago, if they had come at him together, they would have had a chance to overwhelm him. Now though, even together, their best wasn't good enough. As he continued to come up with a new approach to take with the battle, the rocks surrounding him on all sides began to change to a softer, fleshy material that his feet began to sink into. He was almost unable to free his hands before they too became trapped. Kuchios, Gemaguchi Shirbari, summoning, toad mouth trap. Jiraiya emerged from one of the tunnels that had now also become covered in the same fleshy material. Orochimaru bared his teeth angrily. What in the dash? Ah, so you stayed close to the tunnels after all? Jiraiya asked as he climbed his way out. Wow, that's a greenhorn move. You should have known better than that, pal. Orochimaru let the chakra of the Sanbai flow through him, activating his jinchuriki chakra cloak. Damn you. Jiraiya was quick to lunge, his fingertips burning with chakra. Ah. No more of that. Gogyo dash. Before he could connect, Orochimaru extended his neck and bit down on Jiraiya's. Guh. Now, Jiraiya, Orochimaru said, his fang suinka into his old friend's neck. What did you think you were going to accomplish? Cut me off from the Sanbai? He laughed. I know the 5 elements sealing method as well. I also know the unsealing method. Funny that you mention that, Jiraiya chuckled, because that's what I was going for. But, you should always have a backup plan. A red small toad poked its head out of Jiraiya's vest. In its mouth was a cylinder with a seal kanji on it. Orochimaru's eyes went wide as the creature made eye contact with him and took the seal out of its mouth. Keke, Gama Hyaru, barrier, toad gourd prison. The barrier gourd toad wrapped its tongue around Orochimaru and dragged him inside of its mouth, Jiraiya laughing all the way as he was brought along for the ride as well. Both combatants separated once inside of the toad's stomach. The environment inside the toad's stomach was a cavernous chamber, including a lake of gastric acid, along with shores around the edges, and formations sticking out of the fluid. Orochimaru didn't like the idea of finding out how potent that acid was. Jiraiya's continued laughter sounding out over the disjointed croaking he could hear inside of the toad's gullet only made Orochimaru more furious. How? How had Jiraiya managed to turn the tide? Even with Tsunade's arrival, they still hadn't been able to topple him. Now, Jiraiya had trapped him on a battlefield of his own liking. In the end, he found his cool, figuring that everything would be fine. Though it was less than desirable, Jiraiya was still weakened from his poisoning. Orochimaru still had an abundance of chakra, and with Yukimaru's young, healthy body, he had no shortage of stamina. If it came to a battle of attrition, Jiraiya could not defeat him. I don't see what's so funny, Jiraiya, Orochimaru said, arms crossed and grinning as calmed down. He was still in control. Even if you trap me here, do you think this will hold me for long? At that, Jiraiya stopped laughing. No, but it's not meant to. His face turned deadly serious. This ends here. Orochimaru scoffed at the bravado. You would have been better off leaving me to Tsunade alone, he said, looking up at the presumed entrance of the toad prison. I know she's still alive. It will take more than what I did to her to keep her down. Jiraiya smirked and uncharacteristically placed a hand on his hip. Ah. That's sweet of you to actually give me some credit. In a puff of smoke, Jiraiya dropped a henge, changing back into the proper appearance of Tsunade. A well-disguised bait and switch. Just because Jiraiya's techniques had been used didn't mean it had to be Jiraiya who came to face him directly. None of Jiraiya's signature moves that had been performed in that previous moment had been anything that he needed to be right in front of Orochimaru to do. Tsunade's henge had also been tremendous, and the attempt at the 5-element seal had been an ingenious touch to sell it just that much more. As Orochimaru watched Tsunade brush away the blood at her neck from his bite, he found it in him to find humor in the situation. His teammates, for as predictable as they seemed, always seemed to find some way to surprise him. So, it's you and not Jiraiya. This doesn't change anything but the order, Orochimaru insisted. It just means that now, I can deal with the healthier opponent first and finish off the wounded animal later. Tsunade frowned at that. Jiraiya's not that bad off. He helped me get you here, didn't he? At that, Orochimaru began to laugh. Oh. Sage mode must have made him hardier than I could have imagined. He turned his head up to the ceiling as he continued to cackle. I poisoned him, Tsunade. The concoction was quite potent, if I do say so myself. You don't have the materials needed to heal him. Not with the little boost of the Sanbai's chakra, I added. Tsunade glared at him, but as the echoing sound of croaking rang out through the stomach prison, her hateful expression turned to one of victory. What had previously been aimless croaking turned to harmonized sound, like singing. What? Orochimaru didn't understand at first, until everything around him began to change. The croaking permeated his eardrums. It was the only thing he could hear. Four massive toads, all clad in samurai armor, surrounded him. All of them held up a single hand in his direction, webbed palms pointed at him. Orochimaru found himself unable to move as a small barrier held him in place. He felt detached from himself, and that was when he began to panic. No. Orochimaru whispered, trying and failing to do anything for himself. No. He couldn't brute force his way out of it, as he was unable to tap into the Sanbai's chakra. Whatever this genjutsu was, he couldn't break it. He was trapped. It couldn't be. Not after all of this. After everything he'd done, all he'd accomplished, all of the carefully laid plans that it had taken to obtain the kind of body he needed, he could finally have utilized the Sharingan in this body. After all of that, he'd been brought low by his teammates. The perverted lapdog and the degenerate gambler. Two lushes with more failures and regrets in their lives than successes. He had always been the one with the drive to better himself. He had always been the one willing to do what was needed to push the limits of human capability. He was better than both of them. He knew it, and they knew it. And in the end, what had it mattered? Nothing. In the process of trapping Orochimaru within Jiraiya's genjutsu, Tsunade also found herself ensnared by the same technique used against their former teammate. Thankfully, the jutsu by itself didn't hurt. When he'd managed to get in touch with her during Orochimaru's twin bombardment, he hadn't had time to say much, only to give a loose description of his plan. Transform into me. Take this toad. Go with whatever happens after that. You'll know when it's over. She certainly did know when it was over, because it caught her too. She didn't even know Jiraiya knew any genjutsu that powerful. It made more sense when she was freed from the jutsu and saw herself looking up at two small, elderly toads positioned on her chest, smiling at her. One was male and green in color, with white hair, thick eyebrows, and a goatee. He wore a brown little cloak. The other was female, with purple-grayish hair and a dark gray cloak. So, you're Tsunade? The male toad said, been hearing about cha for years from little Jiraiya-chan. This is Shima. You can call me Fukasaku. They got off of her, allowing Tsunade to sit up and start getting to her feet. I take it you two were the toads croaking I heard in the stomach prison. Shima nodded. Jiraiya-chan was a real mess when he summoned us. So rude too. No time for pleasantries. Just demandin' we sing. Have to discipline that boy later when he's not in such a sensitive moment. Sensitive moment? Tsunade thought to herself, turning her head. Not too far away, Jiraiya was on his knees, standing over the body of a motionless Orochimaru. 3 massive stone swords were fatally stabbed deep into his body, pinning it to the ground. Jiraiya leaned against a 4th that was in his grasp. Tsunade walked over, stopping right behind Jiraiya. Her eyes were locked on Orochimaru, much like Jiraiya's. Deep down, as much of a monster as she knew he'd become, as much of a problem for the world as large as he'd turned himself into, they couldn't help but see the boy they'd first been teamed up with decades prior. In lives full of hardship, there had been good times together. Then, they all went their separate ways, and everything seemed to fall apart for them individually. The Second Shinobi World War was their turning point. After the loss to Hanzo, Jiraiya stayed in Amigakure to train those children. This task kept him away for years. Tsunade and Orochimaru returned home, where Nawaki and Dan died, sending Tsunade into her spiral and eventually away from the village. That left Orochimaru alone, with no one to keep him from staring into the abyss he seemed so enamored with. Hiruzen was busy being a wartime Hokage. He couldn't keep an eye on his full-grown student, who was also one of his finest shinobi, at all times. From there, it was just a matter of time. Had they been there, could things have been different? Or would Orochimaru always become what he became? In the end, it was easier to just mark it down as another regret between the two of them. Tsunade put a hand on Jiraiya's shoulder. Jiraiya didn't acknowledge her until she spoke. Is he dash? I think so, Jiraiya said, preempting her. Have to make sure though. With great effort, Jiraiya stood up. His body was barely usable at this point. Tsunade could see that Sage Mode was the only thing keeping him going. She put a hand over his before he could lift his final stone sword from the ground. When he looked over at her, Tsunade to reach out and touch his mask-covered face. The two stared at each other before Jiraiya finally nodded. Together, they lifted the stone sword and brought it down on Orochimaru's neck. Some time later, Hai no Kuni, Konoha no Sato. The Hokage escort party set out from the capital shortly after the Hokage's meeting with the Fire Daimyo, and returned to Konoha by nightfall. Barely 16 hours later, Naruto found himself called to the Hokage's office. He assumed it would be for a briefing, and walked into the building a bit nervous, as he hadn't even started on his mission report. His nervousness turned to confusion when he found Sasuke already there, waiting outside. What are you doing here, Sasuke? Naruto asked as he approached the angry young man. Sasuke ceased staring off into the distance to halfway turn and regard Naruto. I was asked to come by the Hokage. Him too? Naruto thought to himself before saying anything else. And you did? I thought you were still pissed off. I am still pissed off, Sasuke clarified, scoffing as he turned away and started heading inside. Let's get this over with. It's not like you had to wait for me. Naruto, though, could tell what was going on without too much being said. Sasuke didn't want to be anywhere near the Hokage. Whether out of disgust for the man's failure to preserve his clan, or the fear that he might be angry enough to lash out at the village's leader if left alone with him for long enough, he didn't know. Naruto showing up was the kick in the rear that prompted Sasuke to go inside, in order to save face. Had he not arrived, Sasuke likely would have remained there debating on whether to go in or return home until someone else had gotten his attention. The two proceeded in silence until they stood in front of the Hokage's office. Come in. Both boys looked at one another, utterly unsurprised that the old man knew they were there. Even if he didn't have Anbu watching over him, they didn't put it past him to be aware of their presence, given his telescope jutsu. They were both well aware of the crystal ball he used to observe villagers from time to time. Upon entering, they were met with the same sight that every other shinobi likely associated with the Hokage, the wizened old man garbed in his robes, seated behind his desk as he handled his administrative work. He smiled warmly at Naruto and Sasuke. One returned the sentiment, the other did not. Hey, Sarutobi Gigi. Naruto greeted brightly. His mood quickly dropped when he noticed the gloomy aura radiating off of Sasuke. Why did you call us both here? Hiruzen looked between the two of them, his smile fading, possibly because of Sasuke's demeanor, or because he had serious business to talk about, because this involves Akatsuki, and applies to the two of you. Both Naruto and Sasuke looked at each other, curiously wondering just what the problem was this time. Hiruzen let out a tired sigh. It had been a long night after returning to the village. He hadn't gotten the chance to get to sleep, given what he'd been greeted with immediately upon returning. It seems Sabaku no Gaara has been captured by our friend Uchiha Madara, he revealed to the Chunin pair. That guy is not our friend, Naruto asserted, remembering his previous run-ins with Gaara. Even so, Naruto could admit that he was strong. So strong that it was hard to believe he'd been captured without causing serious casualties. Nor, do I believe, are we referring to the real Uchiha Madara, Hiruzen replied, that isn't stopping Tsunade from leveling accusations our way. Sasuke spoke up with a bitter tone, tch. What accusations? I'm the only Uchiha who's been associated with this village in 10 years, and at that time, he was wondering to himself whether or not it would remain that way. Hiruzen laced his fingers together, elbows set on his desk. Cutting to the short of it, they're demanding access for an investigation. He gestured his head to the surlier of his two shinobi. That would be the reason Sasuke-kun is here. I don't have anything to do with Gaara or Madara, Sasuke said, feeling angrier the more he heard. Hiruzen tried to keep a calming tone without being patronizing. I know that. You know that. Everyone privy to this information knows that, he told Sasuke. Tsunade probably knows. But they're angry and paranoid. To that end, they want access to the Uchiha clan district. Sasuke's eyes went wide in shock before his face twisted in rage. Naruto understood. Naruto hadn't even had his clan grounds for very long, and it was a pale comparison to what was probably in Uzushiogakure, but it was still the only part of his lineage he had access to. No one was just going to walk in there and have their run of the place. Not if he was around. No member of any clan in Konoha or anywhere else would have allowed such a thing. For Sasuke though, the entire section of the village that had served as the Uchiha clan district, it wasn't Sasuke's home, so much as it was a tomb, preserved by him in remembrance of his lost clan. Outrage was the only response a reasonable individual could have ever anticipated from such a demand. With his tumultuous emotions over what had gone down with Itachi, and what Sasuke had learned about just why his older brother had slain their clan, it was the worst possible time for Sasuke's frame of mind for Tsunade to try and throw any political weight around, whatever they felt they may have had. If anyone agreed to this, and tried to enforce this on Sasuke's watch, they had best be prepared for things to burn as a result. Hiruzen made sure he was looking Sasuke in his eyes when he continued to speak. The response has already been sent back. They are entitled to nothing, and so nothing is what they will receive from us. It was important that Sasuke know he wasn't against him, that no one in the village was against him. The boy's loyalties were precarious, with good reason, honestly. He needed to know there were people he could trust, even if the Hokage himself didn't qualify as one of those people. It seemed though, that Naruto was one of those people. Fuck them. No way. Naruto's outburst seemed to stop Sasuke's building rage. Sasuke's been here for years, and never saw that Madara bastard before until we were stuck in IWA. Besides, haven't we been sharing everything we have on Akatsuki with all of the hidden villages? Hiruzen smiled bitterly. Again, you and I know that it's everything. But what we know, and what they believe are not in alignment. I feel this will be the last straw between our two villages. Somehow, Naruto sticking up for him got Sasuke to calm down, even if it was just a pinch. And you called us here to tell us first? Sasuke asked. Hiruzen shook his head and stood from behind his desk, walking up to the window overlooking the village. It was one of his favorite views. It reminded him of why he did his job. You are not the first I've told about this. I've already informed all of the necessary parties needed to begin preparing for war. In reality, preparations had been taking place for weeks. Ever since the events at Soraku, Hiruzen had always accounted for the possibility that war would occur. It had been too long since the villages had butted heads in earnest. Even for the men who had already experienced the horrors of the Third Shinobi World War, and in Inoki's case, even the second, it seemed all too easy to forget those terrible days. I summoned you two here to let you know as a courtesy, Hiruzen continued, the two of you are heavily involved in the affairs that led to this. Sasuke's sharp eyes noticed the wince that Naruto tried and failed to hide. Something to keep in mind to bring up later. You're promoting me? Naruto asked, trying to let a little hope leak into his voice. Not yet, Hiruzen said, turning around to smile a bit at Naruto, before returning his gaze to the village, but I expect to do so soon. Even if it weren't for the trial period I set you on, I have a feeling we'd have need to fast-track a promotion during the war. You will be very important in the coming days. Both of you. Upon leaving the Hokage's office, and the building altogether, Sasuke quickly set himself upon Naruto, before the latter could leave and return to his own business for the day. You think this is our fault, don't you? Naruto stopped just before entering his clan grounds as Sasuke engaged him in conversation. Just the fact that it was such a rarity prompted Naruto to respond, even though he didn't want to. Isn't it? Naruto said, before we went to save Yujito from Akatsuki, I don't even remember any rumblings about war. The day they got the information, instead of just leaving Killer Bee to it, Naruto decided to play the hero. He got Neji, Shikamaru, and even Sasuke involved in a cross-country mission of the highest danger and importance. In the end, yes, they had saved a jinchuriki. Yes, they had smoothed over things with Kyumo for the time being. But in the end, it had exposed Konoha to two more enemies and left them vulnerable. From there, everything transpired as it had. Sasuke, though, wanted to punch Naruto for being dumb. Please. You've been gone for years, running the Fire Daimyo's errands. Trust me when I say, things were never square between the villages. Ever. If it wasn't this, it would have been something else. Hiruzen was a Hokage that desired peace between the villages. To that end, he would give the other hidden villages an inch while they would take as close to a mile as they could get away with. Konoha was powerful. It could afford such. But between Sasuke and Naruto, it was the kind of juicy bait that couldn't be ignored by opportunistic villages. It was the bridge too far. And everything since then had simply showed Tsunade how patient he had been. Nothing. They would receive nothing for their previous treachery in trying to target whoever survived the Soraku battle. They would receive nothing for trying and failing to poach Tsunade months prior. They would receive nothing for already receiving everything that Konoha had on Akatsuki, and yet demanding a further concession they had no right to in regards to investigating them. I would get you thinking the way you are if it were IWA that Konoha was about to fight, Sasuke said. We tore into them. But it's Suna. Konoha didn't do anything to Suna. If anything comes from that, it's not your fault, it's not my fault. Got it? That doesn't make it any better, Naruto replied. Yeah. Sasuke prompted, well, you're not going to just roll over and not fight when the time comes either. So make your peace with it soon, because it's the only kind of peace you're going to see for a while. Wow. What a nice guy, Naruto thought to himself in annoyance. A war wasn't his idea of a good time, and he needed more than a day to come to terms with the fact that he was about to fight one. You should try to make your own too, he shot back, receiving a challenging look from the Uchiha. You know what I'm talking about, Sasuke. Sasuke's thorny defenses immediately went up. So now you're telling me how to feel? He snapped. Anger from others was something Naruto had long since been accustomed to dealing with. I'm not telling you how to feel about anything, he said, at a standoff with his former classmate. You know what your problem is? A sneer came to Sasuke's lip. I'm sure you're going to tell me, he taunted. Naruto ignored him and barreled forward. You're the kind of guy who needs a target, he said. When you trained yourself, the only thing you ever cared about was being stronger than Itachi. What's your point? After Soraku, before that chump in the mask told you about your brother and your clan, how did you feel without Itachi to chase? Without killing him as your reason for waking up in the morning? At that, Sasuke stopped and honestly contemplated the question. It wasn't an easy thing to look back on, but Naruto had a habit of making him consider the difficult side of things. Sasuke had filled himself with hate for the better part of a decade. When he'd finally gotten his hands on the source of all of that hate, in the moment it felt amazing, the most accomplished he'd ever felt in his life. And yet, in the days that followed, he didn't even have the time to savor the accomplishment. After returning from his capture in IWA, he'd felt empty, aimless. He'd spent so much time dwelling on what he needed to do to kill Itachi, wrapping himself up in that goal and so utterly defining his entire existence through it that he never thought beyond it. And then, finding out that everything that had befallen his clan had not been of Itachi's solo doing, that someone had prompted him to murder the Uchiha clan, and that this man was dead as well. There was no straightforward target for him any longer. Who am I supposed to be mad at now? Sasuke said reservedly, staring down at his hands where he clenched his fists. Itachi is dead. The elder that gave Itachi the order to kill our clan is dead. And the Hokage. Naruto used Sasuke trailing off as the excuse to cut his line of thinking before it went to darker places. Who says you have to be mad at anyone? It was a quick interjection, and one that prompted the explosive reaction from Sasuke that Naruto expected. Sasuke glared hatefully at the seemingly innocuous question. My entire clan was wiped out. Am I supposed to just let that go? Naruto just stood there and let him vent. Sasuke was an emotional individual, despite how he tried to carry himself around others. The more he bottled things up, the worse they were when he finally let them out. But I don't know who to blame. I don't know who to go after. There's no one in my reach to take this out on. And no one even knows what really happened. But, with what they were now aware of, would the world knowing the truth about Itachi and the Uchiha clan even make it any better? Naruto leaned against one of the massive torii gates marking the entrance to the Uzumaki clan grounds. Normally, I'm all for the truth. But I've been thinking about this too, he said, crossing his arms, a thoughtful look on his face. At this point, it's like, what do you put more stock in? What are you talking about? Sasuke retorted in confusion. Naruto decided to continue digging his hole, offering his 2 cents. If the truth stays hidden, your clan's massacre stays a tragedy, and Itachi is a criminal in death. If the truth comes out, Itachi is a hero, but your clan will be seen as traitors, won't they? That bit of disclosure gave Sasuke pause. Is that why you haven't told anyone? He eventually asked quietly. Naruto shook his head in the negative. It's not my place to talk about. It wasn't my clan. It wasn't my family. It was yours, he said, smiling as empty a smile as Sasuke had ever seen on him. I never had a family, but even I know that certain things aren't anyone else's business. Ichen, was Sasuke's only response. With that, he fell into step with Naruto as he kept heading toward his clan grounds to take stock of his progress on renovating. This was how it had been since graduation for the two of them. After leaving the academy, for some reason, they had been remarkably good at understanding each other. They had their similarities, but their differences far outweighed them. Even so, even with the extent of their rivalry, their past use of one another as a measuring stick, they had a rapport that even they couldn't explain. Naruto loved Team 10 more than anything. And Ino was the closest person in the world to him, but there were things that she would never understand about what motivated him, and why he would do certain things he did. Sasuke would never question his actions, as if he understood why Naruto was willing to march into the teeth of Akatsuki or whatever enemy pursued him at any time. Sasuke could see that Naruto had a chip on his shoulder, that he had something to prove, to himself and to others, much like himself. That, and Naruto's efforts to do so garnered more respect from Sasuke than he had given anyone else. Sasuke's closest friends were in Team 7. Kakashi was the closest thing to a father figure he was willing to accept since the death of his real parents. Yet, if he were to speak with them about the things he spoke to Naruto about, and voice the opinions to them that he voiced to Naruto, they would try to steer him in a direction that they felt would keep him safe. It was why he never told them anything personal. Sasuke never liked taking orders or being dictated to. Naruto never did so. Naruto usually understood him. Even when he didn't, he never tried to influence Sasuke's decisions. He merely sat and listened, offering his own perspective at the most. They were friends. Good friends. Even if they oftentimes wanted to punch the other in the face. Sasuke simply wandered around with Naruto while he went through a checklist on things that still needed to be worked on. There was something about being there that left Sasuke feeling at peace. Perhaps it was how quiet it was. Maybe it was the fact that Naruto was the only Uzumaki clan member in Konoha, yet he was putting in the work to rebuild his clan piece by piece. That latter idea made him think. His thoughts were temporarily interrupted when Naruto spoke up. "Hey," Naruto said, getting Sasuke's attention as he continued going through his checklist of things that needed to be done. "Why did the elders think the Uchiha clan caused the Kyuubi attack? A strong enough Sharingan can control tailed beasts," Sasuke said. "Wow," Naruto replied automatically before what Sasuke said sank in. He gazed up from his list, eyebrow raised. "Wait, what do you mean, strong enough?" Despite fighting Itachi before, and considering Sasuke a rival, Naruto didn't know much information about the Sharingan, other than that it could copy jutsu, and could trap someone in a genjutsu with eye contact. It had rarely come up in his life. Sasuke activated his Sharingan and looked at Naruto, mildly amused when Naruto averted his gaze, as though Sasuke would cast a genjutsu on him. A Sharingan matures with time and training. Each eye can develop 3 tomo. That's a fully mature Sharingan, but it's possible to go beyond that. How? Sasuke stared at Naruto blankly. "You don't want to know." At that, the pattern of his Sharingan changed entirely. "Trust me." Naruto remembered when he saw the difference in Sasuke's Sharingan when they'd almost fought atop the Hokage monument. "So, you dash? Manjikyu Sharingan," Sasuke interrupted in explanation. "I don't know why I'm telling you this. I haven't told anyone about this. But, you've already seen it, so." Maybe Naruto had, but he hadn't known what he'd been seeing at the time. And with everything else that had been going on in the moment, he'd almost forgotten about it. Naruto let what Sasuke had just said sink in. He was the only one who knew about Sasuke's boosted Sharingan. Not Sakura. Not Kakashi. Not Chuji. Not the Hokage. Just him. And he seemed okay with it. How much did Sasuke trust him for that to be his reaction? Well, to be fair, Naruto did trust Sasuke enough to tell him about the Kyuubi months before. Then again, since that time, Sasuke had heard Naruto and others close to him repeatedly declare his status as a jinchuriki as the worst-kept secret in the history of Konoha. So the two of them had faith in one another. Even if Sasuke didn't believe in Konoha so strongly, at least he could admit to himself that he believed in Naruto. And it was then that he realized what a terrifying prospect that was. "God, help me," Sasuke thought to himself. Chapter 81, Ahead of the Storm. After dealing with Orochimaru, Jiraiya was rushed to Ntamayaboku along with Tsunade. One of his last actions performed while still physically capable was to send a message to Tenzo, Enko, and Shizun, telling them to slip away back to Konoha if they were able. Then it was up to Tsunade to tend to him. Even for the greatest medic nin that ever lived, repairing the damage done to Jiraiya's body through combat and the poison coursing through him was no small task. Sage mode had been the only thing keeping him moving. Once he'd let it subside, it was fortunate that he had already been laying down at the time, because his body more or less shut down. It took all of Tsunade's ability and a lot of help from the toads to stabilize him so she could actually find the time to come up with an antidote. She hoped that Jiraiya would actually respect her efforts by heeding her medical advice. She should have known better. It took everything she had to keep from throttling him when he kept trying to get out of bed in order to putter about the toad refuge. Jiraiya, you do realize that I can fix anything on you that I break, don't you? Tsunade warned, so it would behoove you to keep your ass in bed until I say it's alright for you to get up and go. Jiraiya kept himself in the bed of a hut set aside for him by the toads for his recuperation. Tsunade would certainly follow through on her threat if he tested her. Tsunade-heim. I'm hurt. Not dead. You should be dead, Tsunade shot back. If I hadn't shown up, you would be dead. Then I'm lucky you were here, aren't I? Jiraiya cheekily rebutted. Tsunade simply glared at him. She'd bitten her tongue on the poisonous thought that had permeated her mind when she'd first seen Jiraiya on the battlefield. After all, there had been more pressing issues, such as the fully transformed jinchuriki that had been their former teammate. Now, however, there was nothing more important to distract her. She sat down on a wooden chair left for her while she observed Jiraiya's recovery. One leg crossed over the other, she sternly started grilling him. You went out there prepared to die, didn't you? She accused. Jiraiya was almost insulted. He wasn't the sort who saw the nobility in marching off to one's certain demise. Of course I didn't. I'm no quitter. I don't walk into anything expecting to die. If he undertook a mission, it was because he expected himself to pull it off. There were few more capable in the elemental nations than he was. Tsunade knew this yet didn't fall into Jiraiya's careful choosing of his words. I didn't say you expected to. I said you were prepared to. And there's a difference? Jiraiya asked, playing dumb. Tsunade dropped one leg from over top the other, her heel shaking the ground once it made contact. You know there's a fucking difference, she growled. Jiraiya. He was quick to end the current line of conversation. It was irrelevant, seeing as how he had succeeded and lived. It doesn't matter now. It's over. We survived, mostly in one piece. He absently rubbed at the stump where one of his arms used to be. I'll do what you said and heal up here, then get back to the village once I'm good enough to travel. No one ever has to know how messed up I am. At that, a smug expression crossed Tsunade's face. About that, a creeping sense of dread filled Jiraiya. What did you do? Tsunade gleefully held up two fingers. Two people know. What? Tsunade nodded and launched into her explanation. I had to let sensei know, seeing as how if this war kicks off, he's going to see you as one of his major players. If he doesn't have access to you, he needs to know now so plans can be adjusted. That much was understandable. But that only explained one person, and? Jiraiya asked. Tsunade shrugged. I used the toads to get the message there, which means to get there quickly they had to go through someone. Jiraiya had a feeling he already knew who she was talking about, because there was only one possible candidate to move messages to Konoha through toad summoning, but if he'd had any doubts, the loud cry that disturbed the peace and tranquility of Ntimayaboku put them to rest. Ero-sensei. What the fuck happened to you? Jiraiya winced and looked toward the door of his quarters to see Naruto standing there, gaping at him and his injuries. He spared a sheepish grin to his most recent student. Hey, brat. Naruto was not mollified by Jiraiya's failed attempt to play things cool. There was no downplaying missing an arm and being pale and green. Don't hey, brat to me. What is this? You look like shit. Thank you, Naruto. Jiraiya deadpanned, fully aware of his current state. Looking at it was one thing. Feeling it was another. Wanting to get some kind of decent explanation for his godfather's condition, Naruto ran up to Tsunade, getting uncomfortably close to the woman. Give it to me straight, Tsunade-bachan. How much time does he have? Tsunade sighed and pushed the younger blonde out of her way with an index finger. Naruto, I spent 12 hours patching his arm and curing the nastiest poison I've seen since back when Chio was active. He'd better not be dying anytime soon. Naruto listened and found himself dumbfounded at what had befallen Jiraiya. Who could do this to you? He asked the white-haired Sannin. At that point, Jiraiya realized that even though he'd said goodbye to Naruto when he'd gone off on his mission, just in case he didn't make it back, he never told Naruto what he had been sent to do. Just like he hadn't told Tsunade what he'd been sent to do. Looking off to the side where Tsunade stood, he noticed her glaring at him. Apparently, she had made that connection as well. I went chasing after a three-tailed snake, Jiraiya said. It took Naruto a moment to break down Jiraiya's illusion. When he did, a dark look passed over his face. Orochimaru did this? Where is he? The thought of Naruto wanting to fight Orochimaru would have once left Jiraiya feeling quite ill. But now that he was no longer a threat, it warmed the cockles of the Toad Sage's heart. "Oh, we dumped his ashes in a lake somewhere on Mt. Mayabuku," Jiraiya said, summing things up as succinctly as he could. "He's dead, kid. We killed him." The news put a smile on Naruto's face. Akatsuki's not gonna like that. Even though the three tails had been in the hands of someone as dangerous as Orochimaru, at least they had known where to find it. At least they could have gotten to it. Now, it was gone, and it would take some time before it would reappear again. Their plan to seize the tailed beasts had depended on obtaining them all in succession. In a matter of months, they needed the plan done, so that the hidden villages they were going up against didn't have time to come up with a method to deal with them. Now, even if they got all of the remaining jinchuriki tomorrow, they still had to wait for the Sanbai to return in order to complete their plan. For now, they had been foiled. At least, Naruto hoped they had been. Speaking of Akatsuki, at the reminder of the existence of the rogue group, Jiraiya remembered something important that Orochimaru had told him. That his old student Nagato was the leader. There was always the chance that Orochimaru had been lying to throw Jiraiya off in the heat of battle. Jiraiya's state of mind was all over his face, easy enough for Tsunade to notice. "What? What's wrong now?" she asked. "Nothing," Jiraiya lied, grinning at his soul-living former teammate. "I was just thinking about whether or not I still had that mask I borrowed from Naruto's temple." "You'd better," Naruto said. "It's not even mine. It's a clan heirloom. You said you'd take care of it." Jiraiya rolled his eyes, keeping up the facade to keep attention away from his own troubles. "The way you took care of Tsunade's necklace, right?" Naruto looked nervously between Jiraiya and Tsunade, his gaze lingering on the latter. "I'll get that back somehow. Eventually," he assured her. "Ichim," Tsunade harumphed, crossing her arms sternly. Jiraiya breathed a sigh of relief at successfully changing the subject. Dealing with the possibility of one of his students heading up one of the greatest threats in the world wasn't something he wanted to confront while in his sick bed. Defeating Orochimaru had taken a major piece of him. Dealing with Nagato. Well, he remembered what he said to Tsunade about never taking on an assignment with the expectation of dying, but as she said, expecting to die and preparing to die were two different things. Tsunade left the hut to get more medicine for Jiraiya. That left the man alone with his godson and student. His student, being reminded of Nagato, and what he might have become made Jiraiya think about Naruto. He was good, but there was no amount of preparation that was too much. Especially if he was the target of the man that possessed the Rinnegan. "The mask is in my things," Jiraiya said, gesturing to a side of the room where his equipment had been placed. "Grab it now so you have it when you go back." Naruto nodded and jogged over to reclaim his temple's mask. All the while, Jiraiya made final considerations for his aims. "Now that I think about it, I'm thinking you're ready." "Ready for what?" Naruto idly asked as he picked up the mask Jiraiya had borrowed from him, analyzing its design up close. Jiraiya grinned. "The technique I needed that mask for." He noticed Naruto's body stiffen in place, and knew he'd gotten his attention. "You're interested, I take it." Of course, he was. Naruto loved learning new jutsu. He always had, even if the training for whatever the jutsu was happened to be difficult. "The war's about to start," Naruto pointed out begrudgingly. Even if he really wanted to learn whatever it was Jiraiya felt was prudent to teach him, there was still the issue of reality rearing its ugly head. Jiraiya readily agreed. "Right. And you're going to need all the tools you can get when it does," he said. "You said you were going to get Tsunade's necklace back from the Tsuchikage. Even if you were just giving lip service, and I doubt you were if you somehow stumble across him anyway, you aren't going to run, are you?" Naruto thought about it, the idea of fighting a Kage. For so long, he'd held those types up on a pedestal. No matter how strong he'd gotten, no matter what he'd dealt with up to that point, it just didn't seem to measure up to what that word, Kage, meant. Even though he fancied his chances against just about anyone else in Konoha, he still felt that if he fought the Hokage one-on-one, he'd get his tail handed to him. If the Tsuchikage was anything like that, and Naruto had no reason to believe he wasn't, he could count on much the same there. Even so. Naruto shook his head in the negative, confirming Jiraiya's thoughts. "Even though he'll kill you?" Jiraiya added on, trying to prompt Naruto to change his answer. "He did no such thing, and that's why, when I'm ready, you're going to stay here for a little while. At least until you learn what I'm going to teach you." Croaking laughter turned their attention to the entrance of the hut, where a diminutive old toad entered. "What you're gonna teach him, Jiraiya-chan?" Fukasaku said, amused, only thing you're gonna be teaching him is what not to do with Sage Mode. Jiraiya took offense, hey, I'm not that bad at Sage Mode. I'm just not a master of it. What human is? Fukasaku nodded and pointed at Naruto, but you think this tadpole can do it? Jiraiya looked between Fukasaku and Naruto, his gaze lingering on the younger man for a moment as a smile spread across his face, yeah. Not a doubt in my mind. Why would there be? He'd yet to receive a reason to doubt him. Naruto, on his end of things, found himself confused. Wait, slow down. What is Sage Mode? Naruto asked. He'd heard about it in passing before, and knew it was something strong, but didn't know the specifics. Why do I have to stay here to learn it? And I'm sorry, but who is this? Too many things were being thrown his way at once to keep up with. The old toad was more than happy to introduce himself. Name's Fukasaku. We'll be getting to know each other while you're training here, since I'll be in charge, he emphasized, mostly directing it at Jiraiya, who rolled his eyes. Jiraiya took the opportunity to take over the explanation, and Sage Mode is, well, I'll tell you the specifics when we get to it. But trust me. You're going to love it. Maybe not the training, but the fruits of your labor. Knowing what he knew about Naruto, Jiraiya knew he was going to detest the training. We have to do it here because it would be nearly impossible for you to get a feel for it outside of this place. You're going to need to start with those kinds of training wheels. While it wasn't a slight, Naruto seemingly took it as one. I don't need a crutch. Yes, you do / yeah, you will, both Jiraiya and Fukasaku insisted. Naruto pouted at their unity on the subject, but quickly got over it. If what Jiraiya was going to teach him was as great as the last thing he taught him, he could say just about whatever he wanted. When do I need to be ready? I have to talk to Sarutobi-sensei, Jiraiya said. Either I'll let you know, or he will. If Jiraiya's old student was out to take his new student and godson's life, he would ensure Naruto was prepared for him. The haze of war wouldn't give Akatsuki their opening to capture him. Not if Jiraiya had anything to say about it. Tetsu no Kuni Otogekure Hidden Base. Orochimaru was dead. Kabuto had been on the way to join him and meet with his unit in Tetsu no Kuni when everything had taken place. By the time he reached the base designated as the rendezvous point, he was met with the startling news, courtesy of a convalescing Guren. Karen had been the one to inform him. She had felt Orochimaru's chakra fade, had felt him die from miles away. With the keen nature of her sensor abilities, Kabuto didn't doubt her for a moment. Guren, in that time, had been injured fighting against 3 elite Konoha shinobi, including Orochimaru's old apprentice Anko, Tsunade's apprentice, and the only living Mokuton user in the world. Though she was on the mend, that didn't make her any less furious when approached by Kabuto. You weren't there when he needed you. And now Orochimaru-sama is dead. Kabuto endured her ranting as she casted blame and threatened both him and Karen with all the stoicism of an adult dealing with a tantruming child. Are you finished? Because the last time I checked, we're still deep in Tetsu no Kuni with samurai breathing down our necks. With their biggest deterrent now dead and gone, they would need to move quickly to stay away from what would certainly be a vengeful enemy. There had been no shortage of blood spilled across the Tetsu no Kuni countryside while Orochimaru tested his pseudo-jinchuriki creations. There was also no chance that a Kage-level battle like the Sannin clashing wouldn't draw every blade within the realm to the area. It wouldn't be long before the base was discovered. He needed all hands on deck, so to speak. If anyone was more concerned with their personal vendettas or petty emotion, they needed to keep it buried for the time being. Otherwise, they would all be buried in short order. Guren couldn't get that through her head, however, and Kabuto had long since had enough. If you're going to focus on this right now, why don't you make yourself useful and go straight to Konoha to get revenge? Kabuto snapped. Go on. And do us a favor on the way and make all of the noise you can. Draw some samurai to you. Guren rose, forming a crystal blade around one of her forearms, sneering hatefully, ungrateful, four-eyed bastard. I'll kill you. Kabuto slowly tilted his head at the threat. In the low light of the chamber, a glint shone off of his glasses. You'll what? He asked, an unreadable tone to his voice. Guren, you seem to misunderstand what the word expendable really means. Guren scoffed. Unlike you, I spent years preparing to be the perfect vessel for Orochimaru-sama. I was going to give my life so that he could have my body. I get what being expendable means perfectly. No, I don't think you do, Kabuto replied matter-of-factly. That wasn't you being expendable. That was you being a pawn. Being expendable though? It doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean that you're useless. It just means that one can do without you if need be. As far as Orochimaru was concerned, losing the lot of them was perfectly acceptable as long as his own aims were furthered. He wouldn't have hesitated to sacrifice any one of his underlings, or all of them combined, if it served a greater purpose. If it preserved his own life for even a second longer, any one of them could consider their own lives forfeit if Orochimaru had a say. Gyurin tensed defensively as Kabuto raised a hand seal. Even with everything she'd said, and her efforts to goad him into a fight, she was still aware that he was a dangerous shinobi. No one who had been around Orochimaru for as long as he had would be able to last if they couldn't hold their own. "What are you doing?" Gyurin demanded of him. "I'm not going to bother threatening you to keep you in line," Kabuto said with a shake of his head. "This much shows that you can't be relied upon to help keep us alive. And you know what that makes you? Worse than expendable, it downgrades you to being a liability. And we definitely don't need that." Katsu. Pop. Prepared to react to any aggressive action against her, Gyurin hadn't been prepared for her organs to rupture on their own. At Kabuto's behest, a small explosion went off inside of her body. With the sound of a balloon bursting inside of her, she dropped lifelessly to the ground. Orochimaru may have been powerful enough and charismatic enough to keep his rank and file in line, and his cursed seals might have worked to keep his stronger shinobi under his thumb, but Kabuto didn't have any of those things on his side. There had never been anything put in place by Orochimaru to keep his more unstable underlings from attempting to take out their displeasure on Kabuto. Otoge-cure was dog-eat-dog, and had Kabuto been a weakling, his position as the number 2 would have made him a target for anyone looking to get into Orochimaru's inner circle. However, Kabuto was also the chief medic for Otoge-cure. Anyone Orochimaru took an interest in and deemed worthwhile to invest in had been brought before him. And they were all sent to Kabuto as well for treatment and constant checkups. That gave him ample opportunity to secretly plant a failsafe on them, just in case anyone stronger than him in Otoge-cure's employ ever tried to lash out against him. Kabuto had always been certain that Orochimaru knew about his precautions, but let it go, likely as he found it amusing. As a potential candidate to be Orochimaru's new host body, Gyurin had been spared this treatment for years. But when the call had been made to use Yukimaru's potential jinchuriki body instead, that took her immunity to Kabuto's tender mercies off the table. After switching to Yukimaru, Gyurin's well-being would no longer matter to Orochimaru, which was when Kabuto planted the same seal inside of her that he had every other elite that had been sent to see him. He stood there and coldly watched what little life remained in Gyurin's eyes drain out of them, making sure that she could see him at the end. He wanted her to know for absolute certain that he had been the one to do this to her. Karen could only watch from the side. She had been afraid of Gyurin perhaps lashing out against her, but after seeing her be dispatched by Kabuto, it left her wondering if there was something similar planted somewhere inside of her. The sound of his voice startled her out of her reverie. "Karen, are you ready to continue?" Kabuto asked as though he hadn't just killed one of the most powerful individuals left in Otoge-cure's employ. Karen adjusted her glasses on her face, tearing her gaze away from Gyurin's rapidly cooling corpse. Why yeah, what else was she going to do? Fight him? Over Gyurin? Not a chance. Run away. Where? Into the welcoming embrace of the samurai. A graphic public execution was likely in her future if she did that. As things stood, Kabuto was her best chance at survival. "Have the shinobi we have left simply release the pseudo-jinchuriki into the countryside," Kabuto ordered, "with your jutsu masking our presence while we leave. They should provide enough of a diversion that the samurai have to focus on them instead of searching for us." Karen nodded at the order relayed, and went off to carry it out, only to stop when she felt a new chakra signature suddenly appear among them. Oh, but it would be such a shame to get rid of such promising tools so easily. From the voice echoing in the chamber from one end of the room, Kabuto turned to find a man with a mask covering his face, black, decorated with an orange swirl. More notable to Kabuto was the telltale black cloak with red clouds. "Akatsuki?" Kabuto recognized. "Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but there's no sanbai here for you to take." The smooth voice of the masked man let out a hum of disappointment, because Orochimaru went and got himself killed. "Yes, I'm painfully aware," he said drolly. At the ease in Kabuto's body language, the masked man found himself curious. "You're aware that your master is an enemy of my organization, yet you don't attack?" Kabuto gestured vaguely. "What would be the point of doing something like that when you're anticipating it?" "Fortunately, I haven't come here to fight," the masked man said. "It seems we both have something the other could use." Yakushi Kabuto. "Oh? Kabuto seemed unconvinced that there was an opportunity for mutual benefit. The last time I dealt with Akatsuki, Sasori tried to make me into one of his spies. The masked man didn't deny the fact that Kabuto had been exploited in the past for Akatsuki's benefit. Yes, I'm aware. But you survived that, didn't you? In fact, you've survived many things, he said, sounding impressed. You've been deep inside of every hidden village of note over the years, haven't you? Seen and learned much. More than you even let Orochimaru know. The implication hung in the air between the two men. What are you getting at? Kabuto eventually asked. From that point, the masked man didn't bother mincing his words. I will remove you from this situation. In return, you will join Akatsuki, he offered. I've been watching you for a very long time. I have great interest in your skills. And if I refuse? Kabuto asked. Like I said, I didn't come here to fight, the masked man said. But how much do you fancy your chances of standing alone against the wrath of the samurai? He didn't need to say any more. He had given his pitch and had left Kabuto to make his decision. As a show of his power, the man disappeared into a swirling vortex formed in the air. With Orochimaru gone, Kabuto had nothing keeping him anchored to Otogekure. He had no interest in the village. No interest in leading. No interest in using the village to further his experiments. Otogekure would do nothing for Kabuto now other than drag him down. And since that was the case, why not move on to Akatsuki? He'd done the same with Root, after all. It was how he got ahead and moved up in the world. He'd learned all he could about the world from his station and had survived long enough in it to watch it begin to burn down. It was time to cut his losses and move on. With that in mind, Kabuto spared a glance back at Karen before turning his back to her. He smirked to himself as he stepped through the portal offered to him. Well, on to the next one, he thought to himself. With Naruto, Konoha no Sato. The day had turned out to be a busy one for Naruto. After running off with the toads to see Jiraiya and inquire about his condition, he returned to Konoha only to be summoned again, this time through conventional means in order to receive what was supposedly his reward for taking down a member of Akatsuki. Apparently killing an S-rank missing mean was a big enough deal that the villages they came from would pay top price for it, as long as one could provide proof of their demise. If Naruto had known that, he probably would have done a better job of trying to make sure Hoshigaki Kisame's body had been left in one piece. Oh, who was he kidding? IWA would have just swiped that from him too, the way they had Tsunade's necklace. Naruto had handed the sealed body off to the Hokage during his debriefing, and word had been sent to Taki. Within a day, they wasted no time sending a team to retrieve the remains. That team included one of the village's most powerful shinobi in their jinchuriki Fu. It was good to see Fu again. Naruto hadn't seen her in a while. Of course, it also helped that she seemed to be in awe of his most recent accomplishment, his complete dispatching of Kakuzu. The two sat off to the side while representatives from Taki spoke with the medic nin from Konoha that had been in possession of Kakuzu's corpse. Even without the body in plain sight, Fu found herself staring at the scroll that sealed away the body. She couldn't help it. It was like looking at the remains of the boogeyman. Doubly so for her, Kakuzu had been the most powerful criminal her village had ever produced, and he had been a member of Akatsuki set on capturing her. Fu couldn't keep the look of astonishment off of her face. Wow. I knew you were strong, but Naruto. I can't believe you managed to do this. In a similar vein, Naruto couldn't keep the smug expression off of his. It had been a while since he'd managed to stun someone with one of his accomplishments. Believe it, at that utterance, a shiver went down his spine. Ugh. Something felt really off about saying that. Fu ignored the non sequitur and instead focused on the very dead international criminal. Kakuzu was, like, the strongest ninja Takigakure ever had. I know, Naruto grumbled, he wouldn't shut up about it. Fu put her hands on her hips and fixed Naruto with a glare that admonished him as much as being presented with a hot bowl of ramen for free would have. I really wish you wouldn't downplay making a corpse out of a living legend from my village. Well, it's not like he's living anymore, is he? Naruto cheekily replied. Touché, Fu admitted, and the two settled into a comfortable silence as the village bustle passed the jinchuriki duo by. So, looks like we're going to war. A confused expression found its way to Naruto's face. We? Who's Taki going to fight? Fu figured he was being facetious and nudged his arm with her fist. Probably IWA and Suna, dummy. Just like you. After a moment, he realized he had been serious and explained herself. Taki and Konoha are allies, so if nothing else, Shibuki is going to have us watch the border with Tsuchi no Kuni to make sure they don't send people into Hai no Kuni through our territory. I doubt that Sachikage is going to like that. Naruto frowned upon the old man in charge of Iwagakure being mentioned. He'd never even met the old Kage, yet disliked him. You could just let him. I can't see a reason your village would have to fight. Fu scoffed. If Taki folded on that and Konoha lost, what are the chances IWA would stop there and leave us alone? She asked. It's in our best interests that if a war happens, Konoha doesn't lose. We're a minor village. True enough, for a minor village like Takigakure, such a slight against its sovereignty could be dangerous in the long run. As much sense as it made, it didn't make Naruto any more eager to go out and kill for the sake of politics. Does this really have to happen? Naruto griped aloud, and now of all times? Seriously? What better time to try and snatch a jinchuriki than during a goddamn war? Fu could admit that Naruto had a point, but it didn't matter to anyone unrelated to them. What do Suna and Iwa care about Konoha and Taki losing their jinchuriki? If anything, it'll level the playing field since they lost theirs too. The way Fu spoke, she made it sound like they were tools, without family, without any attachment other than the tasks directed of them by their villages. Naruto knew this was how they had always been seen by a lot of people. He just hoped that after years of doing his best, something had changed in that department. Maybe it had in Konoha, to a degree. But what did that mean in the rest of the world? Nothing, evidently. We're not weapons, Naruto said with a tired sigh, we're people. Fu reached out and gave him a pat on the back, something she'd have rather cut her entire arm off before doing only a number of years ago. It was a testament to just how much she had changed that she had reached out to someone she easily considered a friend. And why not? With what was coming, they specifically would need all the friends they could get. Kawa no Kuni. With Kurenai pregnant, the world still kept spinning for Team 8. Kiba, Hinata, and Shino still needed to take missions. Normally, as a trio of Chunin, they were able to go out on their own, but for higher-ranked missions, they were assigned a ninja of superior rank to work with them. For their most recent mission, Tokubetsu Jounin Yamashiro Aoba was assigned to them. They'd had so many Jounin rotate through working with them that they had grown accustomed to working with new people. Things had gone smoothly. Then, they received a messenger hawk requesting that they return to Konoha ASAP. Given the tumultuous state of things before they had set out on their mission, all of them knew what that more than likely signified. After tying up whatever ends they needed to before leaving, they beat a swift pace back home. Kiba grumbled the loudest out of all of them as they traveled. Seriously, we couldn't have waited until after the reception. We went through all the trouble of escorting the guy to the wedding. He invited us. I was looking forward to it. He had been complaining since they'd received the message. It meant he hadn't been able to reap the rewards that came with certain missions. Hinata, to her credit, attempted to keep Kiba's complaints to a minimum with a dose of reality. It can't be helped, Kiba-kun. It isn't just us. Everyone is being recalled. An uncomfortable silence settled between them. While they weren't as grizzled and experienced as some shinobi, they had been around long enough and had heard enough old stories from their clans to be aware of what that could have meant. Recalling all standard ops shinobi only happened for two reasons in Konoha: the passing of the Hokage, or war. It really must be happening then. Kiba chuckled nervously. You know, for a while there, I was kind of thinking that I wouldn't end up seeing a war in my lifetime. Stupid thought, huh? Shino replied, endeavoring to preserve Kiba's spirit. There's nothing stupid about being hopeful, so long as you remained prepared regardless. Kiba grinned back at his teammate. Heh. You don't have to tell me that. Right, boy? Akamaru let out a supportive bark from his side. Hey, Yamashiro-san, you were around during the last war, weren't you? What was that like? As far as skill and notoriety went, Yamashiro Aoba wasn't some kind of big shot in Konoha. When it came to the real elites, he was completely outclassed. However, he was a good ninja, and he did have experience that Team 8 didn't. It stood to reason that they would reach out to him for advice. Hey, I had just made it to Chunin back then, so it wasn't like they were sending me deep into enemy territory or anything. Aoba tried to downplay things to no avail. He relented when he realized that Kiba, Shino, and Hinata were all giving him their full attention, but, from what I saw, let's just say the last 18 years have been a blessing. Even if Aoba had never been on the most dangerous missions during the war, he had been stationed on the front lines and seen his share of battles. He'd seen some of what Konoha and IWA were both capable of when the gloves came off. And this time, there wasn't a Namikaze Minato with a jutsu in reserve that could help them wipe out an army in a matter of seconds. Whether it was against IWA, Suna, or both, it was likely that a war would drag on and be an ugly back and forth. If Team 8 wanted stories, that was too bad. They could ask their clan members for any gory details. He didn't have any magnificent war stories for them. The best he could do was, and when we came to reinforce those guys, I saw a bunch of people with their limbs blown off and crushed under boulders. Not exactly an anecdote chock with meaningful counsel and detail. That was likely why he'd never been slated to lead a genin cell. He might have told them that if they stayed together, they would be fine. But he wasn't much for platitudes. Sometimes fighting at that degree was as much a crapshoot as it was reliant on one's skill and strength. After a while of travel, Akamaru perked up and barked a message at Kiba. One that left him a bit confused. "Hey, guys," Kiba sighed, getting everyone's attention. "Akamaru says he smells people." A few miles that way, he took a moment to sniff at the air. "Yeah, he's definitely right. I'm picking up some sense too." It was odd, because there were no villages or dwellings mapped. The part of Kawa no Kuni they were in was mostly wilderness. "We're in the middle of nowhere," Aoba muttered to himself before speaking up. "Maybe it's just shinobi from another village working on a mission of their own." At that, the usually quiet Shino piped up. "Given what we're all sprinting home for, I would rather not take the chance." The rest of Team 8 seemed to agree. He had a point, as much as Aoba hated to admit it. If there was the chance that there was something nasty brewing, it was better that someone was aware of it than letting it slide and come back to bite Konoha as a whole later. "If it's nothing, we could end up forcing a fight just by being there," Aoba warned, as if that would coax them away from wanting to check things out. Kiba, of course, was the first to shoot those hopes down. "Then we don't let anyone know we're there," he said. "Come on. Last time I checked, we were supposed to be ninja." He insisted, yet Aoba was in charge. At the end of the day, the decision rested with him. Then again, he'd already been persuaded. "Fine. We'll take a look. But then we're out of there." No hero crap would be tolerated under his watch. Their job was to make it home and be available for operations during the actual war. Not that Aoba could imagine any scenario they could stumble across that would require them to stick their necks out. With that, they headed off at the guidance of Kiba and Akamaru's powerful senses of smell. Normally, Aoba would have believed in the adage that curiosity killed the cat, but they were being led by a dog. Regardless, at a time like this, with so much that could be a potential threat to Konoha floating around, they couldn't really afford to ignore anything that they saw as odd. The four-man team pressed on, until a low growl from Akamaru prompted Kiba to relay the message to the others. A serious expression was on the Chunin Inuzuka's face. "Akamaru says we're close, and there's a lot more than he could sniff out at first." He shook his head. "I don't like this at all, guys." "Hinata?" Shino prompted. Without needing to hear anything else, the lone kunoichi on the team activated her Byakugan. Once she did, and got a good look around, her mouth fell open in horror. "There are so many," she whispered, shaking her head. "It's Suna." A frontier detachment, Aoba thought to himself. "How many is so many?" he asked. After a few minutes of noticing Hinata's eyes focus in and out on their target, the feeling of dread in his stomach started to grow. It's taking that long to count. This wasn't good. They needed to get a head count, and get out of there as fast as they could. The sooner they got to the border of Hai no Kuni, the sooner they could warn the patrol groups there. While Aoba's brain stormed, Hinata let out a gasp and Kiba cursed aloud. "Shit! They're coming this way." Of course. They had to have sensors. A platoon meant for scouting had to have some means of making sure they weren't about to approach a force that they didn't mean to. "Get the lead out!" Aoba yelled, pushing Team 8 ahead of him as they began to flee. They had a long way to go to be considered even remotely safe. Konohagakure no Sato, Uzumaki clan grounds. With Sakura and Ino as friends, Chuji and Shikamaru as friends, and, whatever Naruto and Sasuke could be classified as, Team 7 was quite close to Team 10. When Team 10 stopped using the public training fields in exchange for Naruto's newly instated clan property, an invitation had been extended to Team 7. Granted, if they wanted to do that, Sasuke had his own clan territory. But by comparison, the Uchiha clan district was a spooky ghost town. While much smaller in size, only with a temple, a half-finished house, and a lake and field close to the two, Naruto's clan grounds seemed warm and cozy. Bright and full of life. Given Sasuke's state of mind lately, it was a much better environment. That had been the whole idea behind Naruto's open invitation in the first place. It was an appreciated gesture. Ever since Sasuke's episode with the Hokage and the masked man claiming to be Uchiha Madara, she'd stuck to him as much as she could. Even without knowing the exact specifics involving Itachi, she was aware that leaving Sasuke alone with himself for too long was a bad idea. Thus, Team 7 arrived on Naruto's property to find Naruto himself sitting on a hillside just off the path leading to the temple and the house. There, they saw him observing hundreds of his clones in a field. In front of them, Shikamaru stood, holding the rat hand seal, his shadow stretched out over as many of the clones as he could manage. Ino stood next to him, holding her hands in the seal of her family techniques. Naruto noticed Team 7 approach and smiled, waving to them over his shoulder. Hey, guys, he knew they'd been coming because of the security seal he'd set up at the main torii gate leading to the clan grounds. How's it going? Chuji pointed at the display before them. What are you three doing out there? Naruto chuckled and explained. Ino-chan and Shika are training, he said. Shika's got his shadow possessing all of my clones, so he's spread thin. Ino-chan is using mind-body control on some of them. If she can get 10 of them to break free before time runs out, she wins. If she can't, he wins. True enough, there was a large gouge in the ground in front of Shikamaru, the escape line for any of Naruto's clones that Ino managed to get out of Shikamaru's grasp. Seems like a lot of work for Shikamaru, Sakura remarked. Naruto shrugged, still smiling. I'm sure he'd much rather be playing some kind of war game with us, but Asuma-sensei isn't here, so he'd just smash us at any of those. Besides, you can be as smart as you want to be in a fight. You kinda need some brute force to make it matter. He shouted the last part, turning to yell at Shikamaru. Shut up, would you? Shikamaru replied, keeping his eyes on the field of clones. How much time is left? I thought you told me to shut up. Naruto taunted while checking the clock sitting near him to answer the question. You guys have 3 minutes. Ino-chan needs to free 2 more clones to win. Ugh, Shikamaru grunted, but otherwise didn't complain. I have no idea how you got me into this. Shikamaru had to admit, however, for being the twisted brainchild of Naruto to get his teammates stronger, there actually was some strategy involved in the game. Nuance as well. Ino couldn't just jump between controlling one clone after another or she'd burn through her chakra. She had to pick and choose her spots wisely. Also, if she were too obvious about it, it didn't matter how tired Shikamaru was, he could adjust his focus to stop whichever clones she tried to take control of. Since he had control of them via his shadow, Shikamaru could also position them on the field to make it easier to keep track of certain clusters of them and move them away from the safety line. If it weren't for the fact that it was utterly exhausting, he probably wouldn't hate this game. Shikamaru wasn't a fan of the nauseous feeling that came with being utterly drained. 1 minute left. Naruto called. If there was any solace he could take in having to actually put in effort at something, it was that Ino seemed to be just as tired as he was. She'd been quiet for a while as well. Probably trying to focus and think of one last push to try and get her 2 remaining needed clones through the line. She wound up getting more than 2. As one, the entirety of Naruto's remaining clones in the field began to move. Shikamaru panicked and tried to grab them all with his shadow. He somehow managed to get a grasp on all of them, but it was too many bodies to keep under control. Some broke free and made it over the line. Both Shikamaru and Ino collapsed to their hands and knees. That's game. Naruto called out, surprised at the outcome. Huh. Could have sworn Shika would have had that one. Oh, ye of little faith, Ino said, between panting breaths. Phew. Shikamaru flopped down onto his stomach and rolled over onto his back, greedily sucking in as much air as he could. She cheated. There's no way she can control that many at once. He said, all of them. Seriously? Ino laughed, despite her fatigue, and pushed herself back up onto her feet. I'll never tell how. When Naruto dispelled his clones, the information from all of them drifted into his head. Ino had at some point bribed all of his clones that she would do something special for him if they would all coordinate to move as one near the end of the game, if she hadn't won by then, of course. What a remarkably underhanded way to pick up the win. Shika actually still wins, you know, he thought out loud, knowing that Ino would hear him if he made sure to focus on her. Ino let out a tired chuckle. I know. But he doesn't have to know that now, Goldie. He'll figure it out on his own by the time he gets home later. If not, I'll tell him tomorrow. It's not like this would ever work again in a million years anyway. Then again, it didn't need to. Even if Shikamaru had managed to win, Naruto doubted that he would be up for playing such a grueling game again. They hadn't even been competing over any sort of wager. The guy wasn't one for exerting himself too extensively. Despite his best efforts to make Shikamaru more active, years of work in that department had yet to pay off. Naruto turned to Team 7, pleased that he'd managed to give his teammates a good workout. So, I hope you guys didn't come all this way to train. I kinda wiped Shika and Ino-chan out. I mean, I'm still good to go if someone wants a piece of me. He eyed Sasuke specifically, as it had been quite some time since the last time they'd gotten the chance to go toe-to-toe in any kind of spar. Sasuke smirked and seemed ready to take Naruto up on that offer, when Sakura stepped in front of him. Gonna have to take a rain check on that one. It's not why we came. Sasuke glared at the back of her head, and Sakura must have felt it because she rolled her eyes. Sasuke has something he wants to ask you. Sasuke grunted at having someone speak for him, and decided to use his own words. Do you have a medic nin that you can trust? There's a procedure I need done. Naruto looked Sasuke up and down. He didn't seem to be hurt. What kind of procedure? He asked, idly lighting up a cigarette as he listened. For a moment, Sasuke flashed his Manjikyu Sharingan so that only Naruto could see. He didn't know exactly what that meant, but he guessed that it was eye-related. I mean, I guess I do. Naruto said, squinting his eyes at the Uchiha. Is skill or privacy more important? At that, Sakura scoffed. I'm guessing privacy, because he won't even tell us what he needs a medic nin for, she said, crossing her arms as she pointedly turned away from Sasuke. Both, Sasuke said, ignoring his pink-haired teammate's hissy fit. You know Tsunade, right? You also know Tsunade, Naruto deadpanned, not seeing why he needed to be involved if that was who he wanted to see. We all know Tsunade. After all, they had almost started a war protecting her a while back. But she actually likes you, Goldie, Ino said, wrapping her arms around Naruto's neck from behind. She pressed her cheek to his as she continued, I really don't think she knows any of our names. She knows your name, Naruto argued, she sees you all the time when you're with me. Ino plucked the cigarette from Naruto's mouth and flicked it away. I don't think my given name has ever come out of her mouth. She's like, technically your distant cousin or aunt or something, right? And she comes to check on you all the time, when I'm around. You'd think she'd at least try to learn the name of the girlfriend to the closest family she has left. Rude. She kind of hates everybody but Naruto, Shikamaru chimed in from the ground where he'd settled into staring at the clouds, and Shizen. But that doesn't count. Naruto could tell that he was steadily being outnumbered and threw in the towel. Alright. Alright. Fine. Fuck. I'll take you to see Tsunade, he snappily conceded, also a tad irritated that Ino had tossed a freshly lit cigarette, but she's busy right now. She might not have time. Jiraiya was probably still in serious condition on MT Miyaboku. She wasn't going to sidetrack herself for some optional procedure while her oldest friend was still in danger. If Naruto brought it up to her, she'd probably finger-flick him through a whole row of toad huts. Sasuke didn't seem to be in a rush though, apparently fine with waiting. As long as I can get this done at some point, I don't care. Now, Naruto found himself intrigued. More weird Uchiha stuff that required Sasuke to seek help from someone like Tsunade. Naruto endeavored to get real details from Sasuke the moment he got the chance, because clearly, he didn't want to talk about it in front of others. There seemed to be a number of secrets that were starting to be built up between the two of them. Kawa no Kuni, near the northern border. It had been a bad time for Team 8. After they'd been discovered, they'd fled as quickly as they could. To their chagrin, they'd never been given an opportunity to slow down from top speed. Suna's pursuit tactic took advantage of their great numbers advantage. They would have a group push ahead, keeping Team 8 moving to stay ahead of them. Meanwhile, the bulk of the force would remain behind at a more moderate speed. Then, another cluster would surge ahead, taking the place of the previous forward force, while the others dropped back to follow at slower pace. It was an exhausting method of pursuit, and by then, Team 8 realized that when the Suna frontier force caught up to them, they would be much easier pickings, as if they needed the extra advantage. Fortunately, Shino had provided a cushion of his Kikaichu behind them to deal with whoever got too close. Eventually, an approaching group would figure out a way to get through them, but it bought Team 8 time to figure out what they were actually going to do to solve their problem. Aoba could feel his lungs beginning to rebel against the constant exertion he'd been putting them through. Hiding it from the rest of his team didn't get rid of the fact that it still existed. They can't keep this up. They have to stop before we get to the border. Kiba reacted irritably. We're nowhere near the border. The way home was east. They hadn't been going east for quite some time. If they started to look like they were headed that way, their Suna pursuers would double-time it to cut them off. Aoba recognized this. He didn't have eyes that could see for miles, insects that could drain chakra, or a nose that could track a person from half of a country away to do so. But he was the highest ranked and most experienced among them. I wasn't talking about the border with Hai no Kuni, Aoba responded. A tense silence settled over the team for a moment. Aoba then continued with what they were all thinking: if they keep chasing us this way, they'll push us into Amigakure. Amigakure, and any surrounding territory that it clearly claimed, was a no-go area. It had been for decades. The constant warring between other villages led AIM to be incredibly insulated. Its shinobi rarely left its borders, and when they did, they were tight-lipped about life there. The place was a veritable mystery to everyone who didn't live within its confines. Given the long-standing standing edict for all shinobi of the great villages to stay out of AIM, being pursued that way was far from a good thing. However, given the circumstances, it was either that, or try to fight their way through an entire platoon of Suna ninja. It was a bad situation. And when presented with that kind of decision, there wasn't really much of a choice to make. They kept going forward. Perhaps, that was what Suna wanted. But Aoba and teammate fancied their chances of slipping through AIM more than they did turning to face the enemy. They're pulling back. Hinata informed the team, her Byakugan able to see behind them. All of them? Aoba asked, getting a nod from the girl. Must be over the border then. Kiba let out a sigh of relief. No fighting against Suna would happen on this day, this is just a detour. All we've gotta do is ride the border and head east. We'll be back in Hai no Kuni before you know it. One could only hope so. Aoba certainly did. Keep pushing this pace, guys. I don't want to linger in this place any longer than I have to. None of them did. If that was the closest call they had on their way home, they would thank their lucky stars they avoided disaster. They weren't out of the woods yet though. They hadn't brought a map for where they were traveling, and even if they had one, it was likely outdated by upwards of a decade. Hopefully they didn't draw the attention of locals. That's it for part 45. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.